I can shed some light on, how that can work better. So jumping in, I'm just going to give an overview of the special education process, how it works, and then Erin's going to tell you some practical things about how it works on her side of things. So, when you begin the special education process, or even being in school in general, there's all these acronyms, and you have to learn these acronyms in order to be a player at the table. So it all begins, special education begins with the Individual Disabilities Education Act. So that's the IDEA, or IDEA as people call it. And that's really the law that governs how the special education process works, and provides insight into what I'm going to talk about, which is what are your rights and what this process can give your student. FAPE is the free appropriate public education, and the key word in that is appropriate. So I often have to explain to parents. I actually have a client whose child is turning 3 on March the 7th. So they're just entering the system. And I'm trying to explain and kind of set the expectation that you are not going to get 3 hours of speech and language. You are not going to get 3 hours of OT. Your child is 3 years old. You're going to get X, Y, probably X, Y, and Z, because that is what is appropriate for your child right now. It doesn't mean that you are going to get, the Porsche, as they say. You're appropriate means you get the Honda or the Toyota. So you get a functional car, but you're not going to get the top of the line car. That's what legally you're able to get for your student. An LEA is the person who sits at the table, who represents the school district, who has to be at the meeting. So you might hear, I'm the LEA at the meeting, and that's just what that is. LRE is the least restrictive environment. And so that means that on the continuum of services, that your student should be in the least restrictive place. And I can explain more about that later. But in short, you don't want your student with people that are not like your student, that would make it a more restrictive environment. And you don't want your student in a place that doesn't meet their needs. So the least restrictive environment has to, is what the district is going to recommend on the continuum of services. And a 504 plan, I will get to in a minute, but that's a civil rights law that provides accommodation and modifications for students with disabilities. And at the heart of everything in special education is the Individual Education Plan, the IEP. There are a lot more acronyms. A couple of my favorite ones that are not on this wheel are AT, which is assistive technology, which is one of my favorites because I know that my son, who has dyslexia, would not be able to be successful without assistive technology, and all the things that that allows him to be able to do independently. If anybody's interested in AT, I have a whole presentation about that. Happy to send it over. And a couple of other ones are specific learning disability, SLD, and not to be confused with SLP, which is the speech and language pathologist. So I honestly, if you're going to a meeting and you're confused about the terms, Google special education terms, make a little list. And when you're sitting at the table, refer to your list when someone says something, if you get confused, because a lot of information comes out at the same time. And that's also why a presentation like this can set you up for success when you're moving into this process. Okay, so an IEP versus a 504. Most people who are beginning the process are not well versed in the differences between an IEP and a 504. So I'll start with the 504. The 504 is governed under a civil rights law, and it basically is that your student cannot be discriminated against because of their disability, and the disability will impact a major life function. And so in general, that can be walking, talking, eating, thinking, concentration. There's a whole list. So if your student has ADHD, but they function fairly well, you can get a 504 plan for something like ADHD. If your student has difficulty walking, movement issues, in a wheelchair, then they may need certain supports to help them, these accommodations or modifications to support them. If they have an allergy, a food allergy. So all of those fall under a 504. And again, that's accommodations and modifications. So a 504 can stay with you for life, and it goes past high school and on to college. If you're college bound, it stays with you, and you can have certain accommodations and modifications if the school disability center recognizes your plan. So moving over to the IEP, an IEP is special education. It's governed under a different law, and it's federal law that in which there are disability areas, and you would qualify to be eligible under a specific disability category. And with an IEP, you have measurable goals. So measurable goals are different than accommodations and modifications. So an accommodation might be, you can have preferential seating, sitting in the front of the room or on the side of the room. You can have extended time. You can have even social work services are oftentimes covered under a 504 plan. That is different than needing specialized instruction to meet your needs. And an IEP does not stay with you for life. It ends when you take your diploma. So it stops at that point. And you certainly can have accommodations and modifications post-secondary if you've had an IEP, but your IEP does not go with you to college. So a really good example of this, just to illustrate, and I'll use my son, my personal example, is that he struggles with reading. He has had an IEP. He's 17 now, and he's had an IEP since he started in public school. At this point, he functions very well because he uses assistive technology. He does not need specialized instruction to access school right now. He used to, and he did. So he had an IEP for all these years. And now, finally, as a senior, he's making straight A's. So there's really not and you can make straight A's and still have an IEP. Don't get me wrong. However, for him, he doesn't need any more specialized instruction, despite the fact that he still has profound learning issues. So you can have profound learning issues. You can have other things that are going on, but if it doesn't have an adverse effect on your education, you may not need an IEP. That's often confused. So just wanted to make sure that that's understood.
Shira, can I ask a couple questions?
Yes, sure.
So one of the questions in the chat, I think, coincides with kind of what you were just saying. I had a parent ask, should a diagnosis be sufficient to receive a 504, or does the diagnosis have to affect education? I know what my answer would be at the school level, but I wanted to see what your answer was first.
You can answer, and then I'm sure
Okay.
I'll say, that's what it is.
Sure. So when we're in a school situation and we're considering what a parent brings forward around a 504 request, having a diagnosis would qualify you for protections under ADA, but the appropriate accommodations would be determined on what Shira just said, which is what is the impact of the educational environment. So I have had students at the school who have been eligible under ADA because they do have a diagnosis, but we don't see an adverse effect that struggle has in school, and so they don't actually qualify for accommodations. Shira, I don't know what your experience has been, but I wanted to share that.
Yeah. So, I think people also come to me as an advocate thinking that I can get them an IEP. So it really doesn't work that way. Or they'll say, my kid has a diagnosis of dyslexia and ADHD. They get an IEP, right? And, sometimes they will. But I also tell them you don't want your kid to have an IEP for specialized instruction if they're going to be in a classroom with students who are lower functioning than they are. If they're going to be in a specialized classroom with appropriate instruction and instruction that's going to support their need, great. But and we do, I do push for that a lot. But I also know that, we don't want to hold kids back if they can access general education with certain other supports. So example, again, my son, he, he can be in a regular classroom. He absolutely needs his computer reader, his, speech to text, text to speech. He needs speech to text too, but both of those. If he doesn't have that, he literally cannot read and cannot write. He cannot write a full sentence without spelling mistakes, pretty much any sentence. But he uses his technology. Without the technology, he would fail. But does he need specialized instruction, and does it impact him in the classroom? No, because he uses his reader. Now, that being said, I've had to advocate for how that can look in a school setting, because it's embarrassing for him to have to talk into his computer or have to listen to his computer while he's sitting with other kids. So that has been a huge problem over and over every year. I have to send some kind of email, and at this point, he's a pretty good advocate for himself. But it has been a struggle for him to figure out where he's gonna, if he's partnered with someone, and the teacher says, "Now you're each gonna read each other's papers." Well, he can't read that other kid's paper. It doesn't work for him. So that would really fall under an accommodation in a 504 plan, that he has an accommodation that he doesn't have to read aloud in class or read, partner with someone who he doesn't feel comfortable with, or whatever it is. I mean, there's, multiple layers of that you could sort of unpack. But does he need to leave the classroom to go have one-on-one instruction just for that? No. So that's really the illustration of it. Okay, on to timelines. When you request an evaluation, the school has 14 days to get back to you to say yes or no. We will honor or not honor, your request for an evaluation if they determine it's necessary or not necessary. You can always appeal that if they say it's not necessary. Once the school determines that there should be an evaluation for special education services, then the next step is a domains meeting, in which you go through the domains or areas that the school team needs to assess in order to determine if the student is eligible. Once you sign paperwork for the domains meeting, the 60 days clock starts, and that's 60 school days. So school teams have some kind of very fun gadget that they can calculate when the day is. I have no idea what it is. I just kind of do it in my head and say, if it was today, it's pretty much sometime in June. So if you were to ask today, to start the 60 days after your paperwork is signed, you would be getting the results to your evaluation at the very end of school, last day of school. So when you can request an IEP meeting at any time, and a reply from the school is required within 10 days. Reevaluations, you can ask for a reevaluation up to one time per year, but in general, they're done every 3 years. Erin may not love my answer to this, but I actually like to have students reevaluated more often than 3 years. But I certainly like to have them reevaluated before a major shift. So like between elementary school to middle school, or between middle school to high school. So I've always, for my own personal children, kind of made it, kind of fixed it so that, at the end of 8th grade, we had a new evaluation that began high school with fresh data. So that always worked. And you can have an IEP meeting really anytime you want to have an IEP meeting, but you need to have one at least once a year before the date of the last one finishes. So that's just timeline information to keep in mind. Who is on the IEP team? The IEP team is, like I told you before, the LEA, the representative from the district who can make some important decisions, the parents, a special education teacher. A regular education teacher is required to be able to speak to what do typical peers do in the classroom. Special education teacher can speak to the special education program or specifically that student's needs. The psychologist is there to answer questions and share data about the evaluation that they've provided, and be able to speak to that data and make recommendations about from the data to direct what kind of instruction the student needs. And child is really in the middle. And for Erin's students, they're probably all there. Younger students are typically not there. Let's see, yesterday I had a meeting and it was with today this morning, it feels like so long ago. I had a meeting and the student is, it was an articulation meeting for transferring the student from middle school to high school. And the student was there for the first 10 minutes and they were able to ask questions and meet both sides of the team. But it was determined that that student didn't need to be there for the whole meeting because there was a lot of information. The student has anxiety, and for the student to have to sit there and listen to parents, teachers, and other school personnel go back and forth over what should the plan be and how should we do this and what should we do about this, that would have caused that student more anxiety. So it's really something to think about. There are times when the student absolutely should be there, but there are other times when it doesn't make a lot of sense to cause additional anxiety. For my son, who's now in high school and pretty, things are running smoothly for him. For sure, he should be the only one talking and communicating his needs and wants. It shouldn't be his parents at that point, and that means that they're ready to move forward and have something post-secondary. They have gotten the independence that they need, so that would be a positive. Okay, so where do we begin? So you certainly begin with the evaluation. So the first part's the evaluation, and the school does evaluations after you, like as I shared before, you go through the particular domains. Domains are things like academics, functional, speech, hearing, vision, motor, not sure, what am I forgetting, Erin? A few other ones.
Like social function,
social emotional. Yeah, huge. That's a huge one.
I know
Right.
that one.
Yes. So after those, the school can evaluate those areas. And part of what the school does is getting data on how the student performs in each of those areas, but also what their current performance is. I often get questions, what is the difference between a school evaluation and a private evaluation? Um, so it's your preference. School evaluations are going to look at things specific to school and the impact on school. A private evaluation may go a little bit further and look at other areas and other things that they want to look at. Um, and the two can work together. However, you certainly need the school and the private to coordinate what tests they're going to give so that they don't duplicate tests, because you really cannot duplicate tests. Certain tests cannot be given within a year's time. So today I got an email from a very upset school psych evaluator who is wondering why we did not tell them that the child had an evaluation last week with a private evaluator. I think somehow there was a miscommunication and it slipped by, because that's never happened to me before, but parents said they had shared that. School team said they didn't hear it. Somehow that got lost, and it is important to coordinate those. And school teams are not going to be upset if there's a private evaluation, and private evaluators are not going to be upset when they know that, because they know the school has to do their own evaluation of how things impact at school. Once the evaluations are done, either one, and the school one is complete, that is going to give information about present levels of performance, academic performance and functional performance. So that is going to be what do we need to do? How do we need to do it? Why do we need to do it? What are the areas that we need to support? And the present levels, strong present levels, are really important, because that's going to direct what the goal is. And once we develop the goal, once the school team develops the goal, parents can weigh in on it, can make changes to it, should have meaningful parent participation in that process that is based on those present levels, to make what's called a SMART goal, which I'll get into in just a bit. Okay, in order to prepare for the meeting, and this is the part where someone like Erin and I would make sure that we work collaboratively. And so in order for me as an advocate to make sure that parents know what's going on in the meeting and they have meaningful participation and that there are no surprises on either side, this is how the collaboration can look. So parents and I review all the evaluations and ask for any kind of draft documents. Oftentimes, if a student has not been found eligible, the school team cannot give you certain draft documents, despite the fact that they've already developed them to be ready for a meeting. They'll say that they cannot, for some reason they cannot. Well, the reason is because they would be predetermining that they've already said your student is eligible. So eligibility has to happen first, and then the documents. I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago that the school team, despite the fact that this kid had an IEP for more than 3 years at this point, the school team said, well, it's a reeval, and in order to give you the draft documents, we have to determine eligibility. So we can't give you the draft documents ahead of time. So once eligibility was determined, poof, they popped up with this, long list of all the goals. And at that point, the parent really didn't feel like they could hear and digest all of that. So they asked to stop the meeting and have another meeting. That is well within your right, and many people do that. Sometimes school teams, I don't know how legal it is, but they'll say, that you were going to find your student eligible. They've had an IEP for a very long time. We're going to also send you the draft goals in advance. I don't know, Erin, do you do that or not do that?
We send any drafts up 3 days ahead of time. That's our district policy. So we try to get them to everyone ahead of time, but we're very, very purposeful and not using any kind of language that predetermines anything, especially on an initial evaluation.
Right.
But usually there's informal communications prior. If we're looking at
Yes.
a re-eval, or we're looking, at something else, looking at maybe additional domains because a student has a different need. We've had enough informal conversations ahead of time that no one's really coming to the table with surprises.
Yeah, it's not so typical what happened in that meeting. That happens maybe 1 out of 10 times. It's
Mhm.
not that typical. So also, I prepare parents for who's going to be attending the meeting. We look through the list of people who are on the invite. Um, Sometimes we ask to bring work samples, both the school team and the parents. Oftentimes, especially for students who have struggle with writing or have a specific learning disability in written expression, I'm going to want to look at writing samples because, um, you know, uh, having been a teacher for a very long time, I can look at a writing sample and say, this is grade level, this is not grade level. And so I really want to see that so I know what I'm talking about. And so that when a teacher says, oh, the writing is fabulous, the writing is great. And the mom says, they struggle so much, they cry every time they have a writing assignment. And so then there's that discrepancy. I need to see the work sample so I can kind of get a feel for what's going on. I also send a list of questions from parents ahead of time. And I always preface this by saying, time is short at these meetings. So we wanted to send you our questions in advance. It's not something that's going to, cause them to be defensive. It is simply, I'm putting out all of my concerns so that you're prepared to answer them. And that builds trust and collaboration when you do that in advance, because meaningful participation is the key. And that really is the bottom line. So, very briefly, I'll go over this because I could spend a whole session talking about this. But briefly, a SMART goal is something that is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time limited. And what that means is, so for example, and I have different kind of examples here that you can look at and read, but um, so I'm just going to give you an example of a goal that is not on here that I recently encountered. So this twin boys, they're going to from 8th grade, they're transitioning to high school, and one of their goals was they have trouble with work completion. So one of their goals was this student will complete 50% of their assignments. And so, to me, I mean, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time limited. So I had to ask myself all these questions. But one of the problems with that goal is that it was really based on the outcome. And I felt like we needed to take it back a step. So I asked the school team to change, can we rewrite this goal? How can we include the steps it's going to take to get that student to know how to get work completed? So, do they know what the assignment is? Do they know how to track that and write it down? Do they know how to initiate? Like, what is the first step of getting this assignment done? Do they know what to do when they get stuck? Do they know how to problem solve? Do they know who to ask? So, all of those things needed to happen before the goal of they will complete 50% of their work, because they were only completing about 20% at that current moment, the present level. So I understand that we can't say with the expectation, it wouldn't be attainable to say 80%, which is fairly standard, but 50% is low. So you're asking a student to transition to high school with a failing goal. To me, none of that made sense. So I'm okay with the student struggling to, complete some work, but we need to put in the steps ahead of time. So you can see how that goal didn't make sense. And as a parent, you have the right to say, wait a minute, something is amiss here. How can we reword this, redo this? How can we make it And sometimes you want outcome-based goals, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes you want process-based goals. So it all depends on what is the need that you're trying to fill. Okay, so how do I know if my child is making progress? Part of the IEP is that that it will be measured, and this is where it differentiates from a 504. The accommodations that you get, they're not measured to make sure that your student is making progress. So when you get a 504 and your student gets extended time, there's no progress monitoring. In fact, you may not even know if that's an effective accommodation unless you track that, which you can do, and school teams can do that for you. But there is no accountability that needs to be tracked. It is put out there as an accommodation, and that's what it is. But different, the IEP goals will be progress monitored 3 times a year at a minimum. Oftentimes, if parents, you can kind of tell when a parent might need a little bit more communication. Or if a parent, I often tell parents, at the end of the meeting, don't forget to tell the school team how often you want communication and how often you want to know what's going on. If you need to know that, fine. I think you need to be, you need to make sure that you're not asking too often because teachers need to teach, but you also want to make sure that you're not, 3 weeks in, oh my gosh, they have 3 weeks worth of work and I had no idea they didn't do any of it. That's not where you want to be either. Actually, the ultimate goal is to say, gosh, I don't even know what my kids' assignments are because they just do them without me. That's where you want to get to. That's the end goal. Yeah, so that's about progress. Let's see. So just very briefly, so in 2017, there was a Supreme Court ruling that changed special education law. And it is still a very gray area, but it did change things somewhat. And a brief overview of the case is it was a 4th grade boy. He had learning disabilities and autism, and he did have behavior issues. He was not making progress, and his goals were the same year after year. His parents were upset, and they asked for different goals, and the school team came back again with the same goals. His parents unilaterally placed him in a different school for students with autism and learning disabilities, where he made great progress for 5th grade. And then they wanted to move him back for the next grade. And when he went back into the school for the next grade, again, the school district gave the same goals. And so they took this case and it went to the Supreme Court. And the question was, what is the level of educational benefit that school districts must confer on children with disabilities to provide them with free, appropriate public education? So that's FAPE that we talked about in the first slide, that's guaranteed by the IDEA. So what this court case decided was that students, in light of their disability, need to be able to make reasonably calculated progress appropriate to that child's circumstance. So that, really, if you want to know what special education law, how it works, you should read this. It's like 17 pages and it's a great read. It's like a mini series on its own. It's great. But what does that mean for me? What does that mean for you? That means that your child needs to make progress, and it needs to be ambitious in light of the child's circumstance every year. So it is a gray area still, because what does that mean? But the case ultimately left a lot of questions, but it did give guidance on what the law provides to families. Okay, so I think Erin's going to take it away from here.
Yeah, I am. Thank you. So I'm excited to share a little bit about working with school teams. But I wanted to start by encouraging any parent on the call that no matter what level you're at, no matter where your student is, if you ever have a concern or question about how your student is doing, reach out early and don't hesitate to do so. I know sometimes that can be anxiety provoking. There can be emotions going on with it, but you're a key observer to what your student does. We see them part of the day and you see them the other part. And your feedback and thoughts maybe on things that the school doesn't see. And from my work, I know that many parents experience worries and concerns about being a helicopter parent or how they'll be seen if they advocate for their child. But if you have observations, we absolutely want to know. On this slide, I have the graphic that symbolizes a bit about how schools approach interventions and support. So 504s and IEPs are just kind of underneath an umbrella of support that schools provide. It's another acronym. We love our acronyms in education. But MTSS stands for multi-tiered systems of support. And so IEPs and 504s fit underneath that structure. If you look on the slide, there's a little RTI triangle, and the 504 IEP is at the top of that triangle. I'm sorry, my husband was answering the phone. We're traveling at a conference right now. He says he's sorry. But in schools, that RTI triangle refers to the ways in which we respond to students who start demonstrating a need. Schools are really responsible for providing a universal structure, but then also having systems to respond as students start to show that they need a little extra support. And a 504 and IEP fits underneath what we would call tier 3, which means that our building supports have not been effective in creating a level playing field for that child. And so I saw someone in the chat ask about what is an adverse effect. An adverse effect would be something that is impacting your child in a way that they don't have a level playing field when you look at the progress of their peers, or they're not making adequate progress like Shira talked about. You can move to the next slide if you'd like. So I wanted to also outline some targeted steps that parents can take if they observe their child needs support, because I often have talked to people who said, I just didn't know kind of what to do at first when I noticed. So the first would be reach out to your student support team. And that should be information, I would say, that the school should make really clear to you during orientations and during opening days. But if you don't know who to go to, my first suggestion is always the counselor or the social worker. It's a solid place to start. They'll be able to explain to you at least what is available to your student and share observations on the school structure. Administration is always an option too. If you want to find the administrator who's probably over the structure, look for the label of student services. If you're at a middle school or high school level, an assistant principal is probably the right way to go or a good place to start. And again, all those people should be able to tell you where to get the information you want. Also, some important questions to ask about the intervention structure. Like I pointed out in the previous slide, schools have intervention systems, and there could be a least restriction option. And so that was one of the acronyms. Schools really are held accountable to servicing your child in the least restrictive environment. And so this is often where we are able to team with parents around questions of the impact of that student's disability or impairment. And is that really extending past what our universal structures of support can meet, and how is it impacting them in correlation with the developmental performance of their peers? So I don't think anyone on the call who's a parent would be surprised to hear that we are seeing the impact of the last 2 years on kids' executive functioning and their ability to just kind of do student and be back in as student. And so what we're noticing is our baseline of performance is different than what it was before. And so we've upped our interventions that are actually tier 1 and tier 2, because what may have been a need that required an individualized plan in the past is actually kind of a bit more of a universal need because of where we're at and what kids are coming in and the impact of the pandemic. You can also always ask specific questions around, how do I ask for a 504 IEP? Someone should be able to share with you information and let you know exactly how you move forward in that process. The RTI team will review any formal request, and I know Shira went over like the timelines for that. We also really value any supportive documents that you have. So those independent evaluations, if you have those, please share them, because it does give us an outside perspective. My husband's actually a private counselor. He gets different information and knows different insights from a student than sometimes my school team has. And so if you're comfortable sharing those, it does help us come to the table and better understand holistically what your student needs. Sometimes students are exhibiting different behaviors at home that they aren't at school. And it's really, really important that we know that. One of the things I've noticed with high school students is they will persevere all day, but then you hear from parents that they're up at night, they're not sleeping. And there's this anxiety or a way that it's manifesting at home that honestly none of the school providers ever see. And so your impact, we have to know from you or we don't know at all. And so at any time, building administration can get involved and support this discussion. If you feel like it's not moving forward, please don't hesitate to reach out to them. If an IEP or 504 review team comes back and they find your student non-eligible, every school district has an appeal process. And sometimes you may need to ask for an additional set of eyes to look at the situation. And that is your right as a parent to do so. And so please know that if you get information back that the school has not found your child eligible, you can ask about the appeal process and someone should be able to give you information about that. Okay, I think next slide. So a few quick facts that just in my time I've realized I'm answering these questions a lot. So I thought it'd be good to put these on the slide before we go into some time for some questions. So as I prepared, I really wanted parents to know and be prepared for about going into the meeting, which I know Shira talked about. But in schools, we often talk about the difference between accommodations and modifications when determining the most appropriate support for students. So occasionally we'll get a request for a 504, but when we look at the information and what the student is actually needing, it actually is more specialized instruction than it is accommodation in the learning environment. So if a student needs require a modification to the curriculum, we often start to discuss an IEP. This is often where the least restrictive environment comes into play. If we're exploring pull-out structures or structures that put students in a smaller environment, we have to have a reason to do so. And it has to be a data supported reason. And we have to review that because we are moving them out of a space with their peers and we really do support inclusion. No matter what, both plans should be supported by data. I know the goals are different between the two, but I know at every institution I've worked at, especially when we're looking at 504 accommodations, we are asking, is that student using those accommodations? Are they accessing it? Is it showing to be supportive? Because the 504 plan does provide some support after high school, and we want it to also be a gradual release into an ownership of what the student needs to do at a post-secondary level to kind of figure out how they're going to navigate that space. You also always want something to be checked and monitored as it goes. Occasionally at 504 meetings, we talk about taking an accommodation off, and that heightens anxiety, but you have every right to ask, well, if we're going to take it off, how are you going to monitor that they're still getting the support they need in this area? And there should be an answer to that. I think the next point is important when considering the way meetings feel. I'm a big feelings and needs person. I do a lot of the social emotional work at the school. From a school standpoint, we're tasked with supporting students in the least restrictive environment, which means that we have that conversation around accommodations. And if they're not data supported and the student isn't showing a need, we may suggest to put them off their plan, and that causes tension and anxiety. But that's why we need you at the table. And at my level, we need the student at the table as well, because it's important in the process. They're the ones who have to navigate the plan, and they're the ground zero for knowing exactly how it feels in their classroom and what supports they need. It also really helps us communicate with teachers. And then one last note for my parents at the high school level, just around standardized testing, because I've answered this question a lot. College Board actually has the final say on accommodations pertaining to the SAT and AP testing. As a school, we have to apply for those accommodations, but the College Board approves them. Occasionally in the last few years, and I think it has to do with that testing scandal with all those famous people, but they have kind of kicked back to us a request for additional documentation. If we find a student eligible for a supportive plan their sophomore year, we found that they're asking us for additional information to show that they really need that. I think it has a lot to do with just them feeling that they need to justify giving accommodations to kids on those tests. And so we work with parents to get that documentation and upload it, but that's not the school's process, but we're happy to help with that. We've connected parents with College Board. You shouldn't feel like you're doing that alone, but that's something we'll need to work on together. So that kind of concludes the content that we wanted to share, but we definitely wanted to open it up to questions. And so on the next slide, I offered a prompt because sometimes when we open up for questions, people don't really know where to start. But I don't know if there's ways that you can kind of consider how you can apply the information from today. And when you think about application and next steps for you, are there any questions that come up? So I guess at this time, we can probably pull the slides down and then see if anyone has questions in the chat. I will look and see.
Erin and Shira, do you want me to read off the questions that are in the chat?
Yeah, sure.
That
Sure. If
haven't
there's
been
anything we
answered?
didn't speak to. Yeah, of
I
course.
did see one question about what is adverse effect, or what is considered an adverse effect, which is a great question. So, I mean, so again, this is like I mean, I hate to keep going back to my own kid, but it's a great example. So when you think of a bell curve, so if you're looking at, if I can make my arms into a bell curve, and the center is 100, and 100 is considered average, and 85 is the lowest average, and 115 on the other side, or maybe it's reversed for for when you're looking at me. 115 is the high average side. So and that's looking at scores that students receive for certain assessments. So a good example of that is my son's reading. The average would be 100. Well, his reading fluency, oral reading fluency, is a 68. So that's really, really poor. It's in the impaired range. But his comprehension is 100. It is dead center. Okay. So what do you do with that? So what's the adverse effect? The adverse effect is he's not going to be able to read quickly or well, but is it impacting his comprehension? Sometimes his comprehension is 100. So that's really kind of like one of those things where, for me as an advocate, what I would say about that kid, whether he's mine or not, is, well, if he's reading is at a 68 and his comprehension is at 100, if he's reading better, would his comprehension be better? So, that's a question we can ask.
Mhm.
So what is the adverse impact? There's not going to be like, oh, he missed question 4. That's the adverse impact. So this is a conversation and discussion. It's a gray area. I happen to know that, yeah, if my kid could read a little bit better, he would be off the charts with his comprehension. And I know that because when he uses technology, he is off the charts with his comprehension. So, the same thing is like an adverse effect also with another one. Today, I had a conversation with the school team where, this is a very big gray area with kids, the social emotional piece. The kid he happens to be a 5th grader, and this can apply to high school too, but he's a 5th grader who he looks like he's working really hard, trying really hard, but every day he comes home and he is up till midnight because he is so anxious about school because he doesn't understand what's going on. And it looks like he does because he's sitting there and he's trying to participate, but he is having serious emotional issues at home, talking to a therapist about it, sharing with his parents, and he's internalizing that. So how is the school going to see that? So the adverse impact for him is really a lot bigger than what the school sees on the day-to-day. How do you advocate for that? So that was the conversation for a good long while today of, are we supporting all of his needs? Is there more of an adverse impact? I even had a kid who he used to pick his fingernails. Nobody really saw that. His fingernails were bleeding. That's an adverse impact, okay? That there's anxiety from school, at school, because he's doing it at school. He doesn't do it at home. He does it when he's at school. So there it is. So, but how do we get that across to the school? And then what is the school's responsibility there? So those are all conversations that need to be, had with the school team.
Yeah, I would agree. And then like that kind of, again, like drives home what I'm saying, the feedback from the parent. I would not know that child is staying up late at night unless that parent is telling me that. So I could be looking at that profile and they are really doing students from 7:30 to 4, and I don't see that. And so we could come to the table and say, you know, we don't see a need for any kind of accommodations for anxiety because they're not exhibiting it here. Well, they're exhibiting it at home. And that's why it's so important that you're there. And I also think that parents, and I mean, you can ask this question, what is the impact? Because when I saw that question, I was like, well, first thing I would do is I'd pull some assessment data. I'd pull the data of the assessments that students taking in the classes and see how they're performing on that bell curve in response to their peers. And that would just be a piece of what I bring to the table when we talk about adverse impact.
Oh, someone's got their hand
Okay.
raised.
Oh,
Yep.
there's,
Erica, I see her hand is raised. Can you unmute?
Hi, I didn't want to interrupt while you guys were talking.
Oh, you're good.
I have two kids. One is a junior actually at DGS, and we're in the process of getting an IEP. And my younger kid is seventh grade and has an IEP. So you would think I know how IEPs work and what questions to ask, what services I can ask for, I guess. And I'm struggling with both kids. Right now, my main concern is my daughter. She does have a 504. But she's truly struggling a lot the past 2 years with depression and anxiety. And you guys have mentioned the social emotional piece. But I feel like I have to pull teeth when I ask, like, what services can I even ask for? What does she qualify? I mean, we're going to have a meeting in 2 weeks. So I love that you guys came on with this. I'm like, oh, maybe I could ask my question. I feel like it's like hush hush, what supports are available. I don't know if they're worried that if a parent had a list of supports, they'd be like, well, I want this, this, and that. What, I don't even know what to ask. I know you're saying be prepared with questions, but I'm afraid that they'll be like, well, you know, she already has some accommodations or she doesn't qualify, but she's missed so much school because of it and
Yeah,
has been hospitalized. So I'm in that weird gray zone. I just don't know what to ask.
So this is, I feel like about a year before the pandemic, I started to have a lot of clients whose children had school refusal. And I wasn't sure whether there's just a lot of school refusal or I became known as the school refusal lady, like go to her, she'll help you. So I really don't have the data on that. However, you know, people were like, oh, you have that because of the pandemic. I'm like, no, it started before that. So I'm 100% sure that the emotional issues today are just, you know, they're over and above what, you know, we had thinking about growing up. And, you know, I see the impact every day. So some of the questions that I like to ask, you know, and share with schools, specifically about anxiety is, you know, you have to figure out like, I mean, is, you know, how does it manifest itself, you know, for this child during the school day or even at home later on? And then a lot of, and Erin and I kind of touched on this, we talked about this a little bit, but you can also, I mean, and Erin may disagree with me, but when I think about, you know, anxiety, a lot of school teams talk about coping skills and, you know, ways that students can calm down from the anxiety. So, you know, they can use coping strategies, counting, mindfulness, taking a break, you know, all of those things. So, you know, my question is always going to be, well, when they take a break and they go out, what are they missing? And then is that causing more anxiety? So does that work? Does it not work? I mean, is the person suggesting it thinking that through? The other one is, you know, counting to 10, out from 10 or whatever. Okay, that may calm your body and get you regulated, but you're still going to have anxiety then going back because you still have the same problem. You haven't solved any problem when you're counting or when you're taking a break or when you're, you know, doing whatever it is that, you know, like using a fidget or whatever the suggestions are. So I always ask the school teams, you know, what happens with the anxiety when you use the coping skill? And for me personally, my anxiety doesn't go away until my problem is solved or until I figure out the steps to solve it. So when I know, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this, that's my action plan. I don't have as much anxiety. I also am okay with talking to school teams about it's okay to be anxious and keep going. So there's a lot of different, I mean, that is just a huge, it depends on really the kid and how what it looks like and how deep it goes. So there are, 100 ways to answer that question, probably. For every kid, it's going to be different. Does Erin have a different?
I guess I don't have a different perspective actually, but I think that I would absolutely second the questions that you shared. I'd also say that I know that you shared, Erica, that your child may already have a 504 in place or a formalized plan. When I came back, what I would like to happen at that meeting, I guess, is let's talk about how that plan is or is not meeting their needs. Kids' needs evolve. And so if you are seeing an increase in anxiety, and I will say school refusal is off the charts across the board, but it also was on that trajectory prior. This just exacerbated it. The anxiety and the I can't go into that space, we've seen it for a little while. It's a very anxiety provoking space. But if your student already has a plan, but you're seeing a struggle that plan is not addressing, I would come to the table and say, like, I understand that this plan is in place, but I don't see an accommodation that I feel is going to address during the day them working through this need that I'm seeing as a parent. And so what does that look like? And at the schools at any school that I've been in, there is a structure of processing, but like Shira said, like if you're looking for what she kind of described is kind of a goal, like what is the goal? And that ends up getting into the IEP area. Do you need an articulated goal that then we're going to progress monitor, or do you need an accommodation where you can actually remove yourself, reprocess, and go back into the learning environment? Because if we have too much leaving the learning environment and processing, then we're going to academically see some impact. And so we want to make sure that what we're putting in place is appropriate and the student is able to still engage in the academic environment.
Right. And a goal around anxiety could be something like that. You begin to identify what makes you anxious, and then you can create a plan of action of how you're going to work through that, or how you're going to problem solve. A lot of times, anxiety can involve perspective taking, can involve, thinking flexibly about something. And those are all executive functioning skills that need to be built up. So that kind of, although it's in the social emotional, it's really also in the functional in terms of how you process things, information, how you process anxiety, and how you work through those kind of things. So
those two boxes are interrelated all the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we had another hand, Valerie. We have a couple minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. We're kind of in a similar situation to Erica, where we have a 504 in place, which was put in place at the beginning of this year. A lot of anxiety, school refusal, difficulty with schoolwork, challenge, and we actually had to pull them from school last year during remote learning and do homeschooling because it just got so bad, as far as panic attacks related to academics and difficulty learning and focusing. And this year we went through and did a private neuropsych evaluation, which we haven't completed. We've completed one portion of it, but because the anxiety was so great, they weren't able to, get all the pieces to the puzzle. And when we presented what we did have with the school, I feel like we're met with, kind of a wall of, well, the neuropsych identified, specific learning difficulty with math and writing specifically. And, but because their MAP scores are in this range, they don't qualify for an IEP. But, you also mentioned, if we're seeing greater things at home, the school teacher saying, oh, I think they understand it. I think they're fine. But my daughter is very quiet, will not advocate for themselves, will not say when they need a break, will not say, I don't understand. So at the end of the day, we're seeing that, the repercussions of that, where she's like, I don't even know how to do my homework. I don't know how to get started. So I guess my question is, how can we get the district to see that they're there is an adverse effect and we need more than just these accommodations, modifications, despite the fact that they're, standardized tests are okay.
One of the things I can suggest for you to do is to start a log at home of what you're seeing and what your child is feeling or reporting. So, you can keep that every day. And, today we tried to do, my child was doing, a math worksheet, and this is the reaction, this is what we did, this is the, whatever it is, just log it. I think you said did you say it's a fifth grader or it's a younger?
It's a fifth grader. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, really in fifth grade, I mean, that child should be pretty much doing things on their own. You shouldn't be having to have heavy support.
Right.
And if you are, then that, you need to be, the problem is parents don't want to let their kids fail. So you're not going to say, you know what, not helping you, go back and take it to school so that the teacher can see that you're having trouble.
Which I actually have been doing that. I'm like, you know
Okay.
what? Put a question mark on the questions that you have no idea how to do.
Right.
Get done whatever
Right.
steps you can.
Right. And that's also going to cause, there's somewhat of an anxiety level when you go back to school and you're like, here, I don't know how to, all the question marks. So I would create a log and log that and log it, for a week, 2 weeks, and then, have a meeting. But also, your child also needs to begin to learn to advocate too, and begin to learn to ask their teachers, how do I make a plan, or coordinate with their teachers how to make a plan of action so that I don't feel so overwhelmed. So meaning, and you can facilitate this. I have trouble when I get home doing my homework because I feel overwhelmed. I'm not sure why I feel overwhelmed or what I feel overwhelmed about, but how do I work on that? And, what is my plan? So, when I get home, I'm going to it will be a list, a prioritization of what needs to be done. And then I can go through my list. Chances are, like today, I was working with a family and they were talking about how earlier in the year, the kid could literally not make a list of what to do. Now they've learned, guided by their teacher, to make the list. And the teacher says, where are you on the list? And the kid answers, oh, I'm on this one. I know what to do next. And that has lessened the anxiety around that particular child because they have a plan. They know what to do. They know what's next. They know what's coming up. That's not going to work for everybody, and it's a process. And look, that kid that I just told you about, he worked on this for the past 6 months. So knowing that it was an identified area that needed growth back in September, that's what the school team's been working on, and it's been effective. So, those are a couple of ideas you could work on.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in unless you guys had anything else you wanted to cover. We're past our time. We're at 8:15, so I wanted to let everyone go and not eat into the rest of everyone's evening. But thank you so much. I think this has been great. We've had a great group and everyone's stayed on. If parents have questions or other specific needs, what can they do? Who can they reach out to?
If Erin and I we're so like-minded, I'm sure she'll say, just email
me. Yes. I was like, email me. I'm happy to answer a question or help you find who can answer the specific question in the institution that you're a part of. Happy to consult.
There was one question in the chat that I think it was directed to you, Shira. Do you offer executive functioning coaching or classes?
I have lots of people that do that.
Okay.
But so lots of people I can refer. But I will tell you, everybody is full.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
And what I'll tell you about executive functioning, this is a warning. Um, and Erin will probably say, yep. Okay, so there's a lot of people who are executive functioning coaches who are going to tell your kid, okay, now do this, now turn the page, now do this one, now you're going to do this one. Okay, now we're done with that. Now let's go on this, and now turn this in. And that may be getting your work done, but a very good executive functioning coach will flip that script, and the script will be, so how do you know what you're supposed to do? So how are you going to decide what to do first? How are you going to prioritize your list? How are you going to break this down? How are you going to, on and on and on? That may need scaffolding at the beginning, because you might not be able to answer right away. Oh, I think I'm going to do this first. Kids just don't do that. No, I mean, high schoolers don't do that too. So you may need to say, okay, well, here's how it can look. And then tomorrow you're going to make your list, or next month you're going to be responsible, or next year, however long it takes. But it should be a gradual release, and not a finish this and stop the bleeding. And then it can't be that. Otherwise you're just paying for your kid to end up going to, the next grade and fail.
We say that you're paying for a manager, not necessarily someone who's coaching them.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to steal that.
Go
Thanks.
ahead. I was like, they're just being a manager, and that's actually not going to give them the skills, because we want them to be able to go to post-secondary and be able to manage it at a job or in college. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Thank you everyone for attending. We will have a recording made available, and if you can take a second to fill out the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Thanks so much. Thanks to both of you for your expertise and for all you do for our kids. We appreciate it.
Thanks. It was fun.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Good night.
Good night.